I think the first and probably the most important point to make from a practitioner's perspective is to say that this is a very welcome report indeed, analysing what is inevitably a complex area, and I think Kathy and Catherine, Kieran and the team at ACF are to be commended. In a sense, this is a report that becomes more and more valuable with every year as we get to see longer term trends. And I think this year's report is a particularly beautiful and elegant one, actually. And I think the inclusion of increased level of analysis as well as the statistical data is another welcome development. If it's a philanthropic sector and a foundation sector we are to have a voice, then this type of data set I think is crucial. Of course, I don't need to say to the people in this room that we inhabit a complex and messy and fragmented sector, and I guess the danger of that is that the challenges associated with the survey mean that either it isn't undertaken at all, or when it is undertaken, the response descends into some kind of methodological debate. And certainly there are questions that are inevitably thrown up. I shall steadfastly resist those, because I think the key thing from my perspective, I suspect from any perspective this year, is this heartening headline. The asset value of the 300 foundations is up, our income is up, our grant giving is up, and these are not marginal increases. A total giving increase of 12% is an impressive figure. And of course it takes place in a context where the charitable sector as a whole is feeling beleaguered, battered, feeling the effects of government retrenchment. So I think it's very good to be able to stand here and say we are one of the very few areas of charitable giving seeing this type of increase. So in a wider sense, there are any number of points, I think, that could be drawn out for debate and discussion. I will restrict myself to 4 comments, and in doing this I'm deliberately trying to perhaps be slightly provocative, so you'll have to bear with me. Sir Trevor warned me that if he didn't agree he would be waving his hands at the back, so I will steadfastly avoid his gaze. Perhaps the first point to make is that this very welcome growth is essentially internal growth within existing organisations. One of the striking things about the report is how few large foundations now appear to be being set up. And it seems to me that this is an area that's eminently worthy of debate and discussion. If we take, let's say, the top 15, one is from the 17th century, 2 are from the interwar period, and then the very large majority of the rest was set up in that golden period for foundations between the end of the Second World War and about 1970-75. Wolfson Foundation fits within that mould, 1955, but others include Western 58 with their anniversary next year, Esme 62, Monument 65, and so on. I suppose my point is that this is a report that to some considerable extent is about old money being put to contemporary use. So the report tells an exciting story of growth, but there's potentially also a more sobering story of stagnation that sits alongside that. There are, it seems, relatively few new sources of major giving within British society. Secondly, the reasons for that 12% growth this year, as Kat and Catherine have shown very well, are diverse, include new donations, including organisations spending out. But it's fair to say that the predominant reason is the growth in value of endowed charities. So the growth, to some extent, then, is a function of what is happening in international markets. The report states that, in a sense, this is the beginning of a trend that we might call the Brexit bounce. Certainly the Wolfson Foundation, and I'm sure the large majority of globally invested endowment funds, are seeing their asset values rise quite dramatically, largely actually as a result of the value of the pound falling. And I've got no doubt at all we'll see that even more dramatically in the report that we presume will come out, we hope will come out next year. But it seems to me that then this raises interesting and perhaps controversial questions for particularly endowed foundations. It seems reasonable to assume that many of the organisations that we work with are negatively impacted by Brexit and by what will be the fallout from Brexit. Yet we, or at least some of us, are benefiting significantly financially. So is there perhaps a debate to be had about the obligations that then sit with us to use some of this additional value directly to mitigate some of the detrimental effects that might come from leaving the European Union? Third point, I switch tack slightly. During the first 6 months of the year, the issue of mandatory payout for foundations has again raised its head, debated through the pages of journals like Alliance, for example. That, as you know, is the argument that government in the UK should force foundations to spend a certain proportion of their asset value every year, generally set at 5%. And that debate will no doubt continue. The point that I think it's worth making in the context of this report is that the levels of spend, I think, entirely undermine a sense that as a sector we somehow need a stick to force us to spend money. It seems to me, at least, a solution to a problem that simply doesn't exist, and the report helps to skewer, I think, some of those arguments. So I've had 3 relatively negative points, so let me conclude with my last point, which is a rather more upbeat one. The report, I think, rightly recognises that we're not simply driven as a sector by headline financial figures. Levels of giving are important, but they're not the only thing. And increasingly, many of us are not even seeing ourselves exclusively as grant makers. Some of us attempt to add value to our giving through a whole quiver full of options: social investment, lobbying, commissioning of reports, direct programmes. So perhaps the most compelling pages of the report for me were pages 14 and 15. Those were the pages that Kat spoke about at some length. And I think they give brilliant examples of imaginative initiatives undertaken by foundations, and interestingly, very often in partnership with others. It's a tip of an iceberg, and the other examples, no doubt, could have gone on to fill a report much larger than the whole of this report. But I think, if nothing else, it gives lie to the view that we, as a sector, are intrinsically insular, or stubborn in our independence, or somehow lacking in dynamism in our approach to social problems. So, as I said in my very opening words, this is, I think, very much a report to be welcomed. And it's to be welcomed not least because it helps to paint that picture, a picture of a sector that, whatever its challenges, is dynamic and continues to work imaginatively to deal with the major societal challenges in the UK and beyond that sadly are not going to go away anytime soon.